The Bear Roars special edition series, Bandwidth, serves as a platform to celebrate the people and stories of Dan's book. Bandwidth, the untold story of ambition, deception, and innovation that shaped the internet age and the dot-com boom. The story covers the epic journey of the creation of the internet's backbone, the building of the early competitive fiber networks in the 1990s, the bandwidth boom, bust, and resurrection ending in 2020 when Dan's company Zayo was sold. The book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Head to dan-caruso.com/book for more details. In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan Caruso, founder of Zayo, sits down with Drake Livingston, a seasoned telecom pioneer who played a role in one of the boldest infrastructure plays in history. Together, they unravel the story behind Spread Networks, a scrappy, visionary effort to build the fastest fiber route between Chicago and New York. Drake reflects on how Spread's team quietly constructed a perfectly straight fiber line, cutting through the noise and terrain of traditional networks, reshaping high-frequency trading and connectivity standards across the country. They also reflect on what followed, Zayo's acquisition of Spread and how the combined journey informed the future of fiber and the infrastructure behind the internet itself. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
Drake, it's so good seeing you. It's been a while.
It's been quite a while. It's very good to see you as well, Dan.
So Drake, as we're going to find out today, is, I'm sure, in the top 5 Zayo employees that came along with one of our acquisitions. That's probably unfair to a few people because there are probably more than 5 people who qualify for being in the top 5, but you are certainly one of them, and we are getting the reasons why, and it's going to be fun.
Well, thanks. I'm looking forward to hearing your side of it as well. I think there's a lot of things we can catch up on.
Yes, for certain. And we're going to do a little bit of business to kick this off.
All right.
You ready?
Okay.
All right.
Well, not sure I was prepared for this.
Yes, you are. So I am going to sign for you your copy of Bandwidth.
Thank you.
In fact, you surprised me with the reach out about the book. You said you were going to be in Boulder, and I came back with, let's do a podcast.
That's right. I just wanted a signature on a book. I mean, I already had the Kindle version, but you can't sign that.
Yep. But I'm going to get a signature from you as well on this book called Flash Boys. And I'm going to tell you the surprise I have for you. That is, you're not the first signature on this book.
Well, good. I shouldn't be.
And you're not the second signature on the book. And you're not even the third signature on the book. So let's see here. We got 2 signatures from people with the last name of Barksdale.
Yeah.
And then we have one other signature who is your boss, the CEO.
Spivey.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us about these 3 people and who they are, and tell us what Flash Boys is all about.
Absolutely. So you're talking about here Jim Barksdale, David Barksdale, and Dan Spivey. Mm-hmm. So this is they were the founders and owners and ran the company that you bought in 2018, Spread Networks.
Yes. And maybe let's start with David. Like this, yeah. David's an iconic name, so. Let's talk about who David Barksdale is and his significance, because he brings a lot of significance to the table.
Yep.
And maybe take us through kind of how he became involved in Flash Boys, and then we'll step through the other 2 as well.
Sure. So when the Barksdales became invested in Spread and became the owners, David was, as I understood it, because I came in just after he came in, mm-hmm. David was a lawyer at the time in New York City, mm-hmm. and he came in and started getting all the right-of-ways for the Spread line, which was a greenfield fiber line built straight between the Chicago Mercantile Exchange
straight,
and NASDAQ.
We mean straight.
I mean straight as straight can be. I mean, it's not the geodesic, and we can talk about that more when we talk about wireless, but in terms of fiber, right? Every other fiber route, when they were built to get to people, get to eyeballs or ears initially, and then eyeballs. And so they'd go from major city center to major city center where the biggest people were.
And they would try to pick up other city centers along the way, which added to the distance in the routes.
Exactly. Whereas we didn't want to touch a single human or thing in between the trading exchanges in New Jersey and Chicago. So it's all about building it straighter.
And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this. Let's get into a little bit more on the name. So David is the son of Jim.
Jim, yep.
So who's Jim Barksdale?
So, well, I know that you know Jim. You knew Jim before I did, because Jim was originally leadership at FedEx and the CEO at FedEx. And so he helped build up FedEx from the company when it was very small and not a known entity that it is now. So he had a lot of great stories over the years of them building up. Especially, I really enjoyed when he used to talk about what was that film with Tom Hanks and the beach ball, Wilson?
Oh, yes.
Yes, that one, FedEx.
Wilson, where
Castaways,
Tom
yes.
was pretty much the only one in the movie for
Yep.
long periods
So
of time.
FedEx played a key role, obviously, in that, and he was involved in that. So he was there, and then he was part of McCaw Cellular, which became the first when AT&T got into wireless via their acquisition of
Which
McCaw.
is the story of McCaw's is part of what's told in Bandwidth.
Yep.
Including, it focuses more on the McCaw's fiber company because the book is about bandwidth. But when describing Craig McCaw, it talks about his entree into wireless as well. He was a pioneer in wireless, and eventually how that was used to in the aggressive transformation of AT&T across multiple different areas, including cellular, how AT&T bought it. So Jim comes up, I think, for the first time in the book, in that section.
Yep. So he was our owner and our chairman and was very involved in the spread project throughout its life.
But Netscape as well. He was also had played a role in
with
the early
Andreessen,
days of Netscape.
Yep.
So when
he was the CEO there.
started Netscape, but then he brought in, I think, Jim to be CEO, if I remember.
Yep.
Right. Is that correct?
I think he was kind of the adult in the room for a while.
Yes.
And helped grow them, during that period of the internet.
Okay. So how did the two Barksdales, how did they first get
involved with spread?
Well, what was the spark behind that?
So you almost have to talk about Dan in order to answer that question. So Dan Spivey was the founder of Spread. He's the reason that I got involved at Spread. And so he was a trader. He was trading SPY, index, and he was trying to get information.
And when you say trading SPY index, what does that mean for listeners?
So he was trading a basket of like the S&P 500, and he was using information from the CME futures data to inform his trade. And so therefore he wanted to get data faster from Chicago to where he was trading it in New Jersey and New York. And he found it difficult to get the information there faster. There were ways. For example, Verizon was known to have what was called the Verizon Gold Route. At the time, that was the fastest. It was around 14.5 milliseconds round trip delay. That's usually how you talk about fiber latencies. And, that's the time it takes to go from Chicago to New York, New Jersey, where the exchange data centers are, back to Chicago. That's a round trip time. So it was about 14.5 milliseconds. That sounds super fast, right? I think we blink. Takes a couple hundred milliseconds to blink. Yeah. So it's a time scale that's faster than I can at least relate to physically, but it is still much lower than the speed the computers are going in terms of making trading decisions. Okay. And that speed has only increased over time.
So what Dan was doing is he was trying to use kind of as best he could, real-time data that he could get sitting in New York from Chicago.
Yep.
So that it could give him some indication of what's going on in the stock exchange in Chicago so that he could make a trade in New York.
Yep.
Is that the right way to think about it?
That is.
And at the time, the fastest way to do that was using a Verizon route that would take, as you said, 14 milliseconds or so to get that information. So,
But it wasn't easy to buy that from Verizon. Like they didn't market it. They didn't really recognize what it was. And so you had to order a bunch of circuits. These are back, and I know you'll know these terms, but these are the back in the days of DS3s, OC3s, that sort of thing. So you had to buy a bunch of services and hope you got it on the fast path.
So they weren't selling the path.
Weren't marketing and weren't selling it.
Yeah. So
couldn't even deliver it if you asked for it.
Yeah. So you wouldn't know if they were going to give you that fast path until you placed multiple orders. Then you test them and figure out, okay, this particular service, at least for right now, was along this fast path. I'm going to use that one.
Yep.
In order to get the information faster than most.
Yep.
Were others doing that, or was Dan one of the first to discover that?
He was one of the first to build a purpose-built exchange-to-exchange low latency network. What I found out over time is that there were some trading firms that had patch together their own. Ultimately, it was taking multiple disparate carriers and service providers and kind of leaking them together like a quilt. Whereas no real carrier, service provider, telecom company had done it themselves, because in the end, most carriers want to use their own network.
Yep.
Where they can, and they don't really want to go buy someone else's network and patch together unless they have to. So I don't think it was really recognized, the opportunity that was there.
So what were you doing at the time before Dan got going with the Flash Voice network, the spread network, and he was using the current network but trying to trade that way? What were you doing at that time, and what was your relationship with Dan?
So I was working in telecom. So my career has kind of a couple different eras to it. The first third I spent working for hardware manufacturers. So first job out of college was with Alcatel back in the day when they were a huge company, and now it's Nokia. And then at the time I met Dan, I was working for Ciena.
Okay.
And
you were doing what for Ciena?
I was selling to enterprise. I was selling our WDM gear and services and hardware to enterprise services. And I remember when we had a team call and someone said, "Hey, there's this guy in Mississippi who says he's building a long haul fiber network and needs some, hardware to light it. And I think he's crazy. I don't want to waste my time because no individual builds long haul fiber networks and lights them with WDM gear. It's just, he must just be a little bit crazy. Does anyone, before I just start ignoring his emails, does anyone else want to take them?" And I volunteered to actually take Dan as the account and talk with him, because I was curious, and it was something that I was like, well, let me go see what this guy's all about.
And we're going to learn that was a very wise decision.
Yes.
So let's go a little bit backwards in time again, and let's talk about at that point you hadn't met Dan, but since then you've gotten to know the story really well. Take us back to Dan's first trading on the existing Verizon network. Interestingly, he's in Mississippi, so maybe you could help us understand how sitting in Mississippi when he needed the trades between the exchanges of New York and Chicago, how that factored in or didn't factor in. But maybe take us through, I should have contacted Dan and have him do a surprise phone call here, but but tell us how, in fact, you know what? I'm going to have one of you guys take my phone here and maybe send Dan a text, and maybe we'll get lucky and he can call us and we'll talk to him together during the live podcast. So what's your memory of how Dan went from, I'm using an existing network, to this idea of, I'm going to build a fiber network?
Absolutely. Well, you were asking about the trading side. Let me be clear. I'm a telecom geek.
Yes.
I'm not a trader.
Yep.
So I don't have experience or
expertise
there.
I think you do have expertise at this one.
But I ask a lot of questions, and I like to understand. Ultimately, that's what we did at Zayo, right? Is try to understand the needs of the market when it comes to trading firms. And so ultimately, traders nowadays, this is all quantitative trading. They're all for the most part mathematicians and software developers who create an algorithm that is the thing that is doing the trading. And ultimately, you take information from one exchange and you use that information at another exchange in a different location. Sometimes that involves arbitrage, other times it's doing other things, but that's ultimately what he was doing. So you can physically be anywhere in the world trading. You just need to make sure that your algo is located and your information is at the trading exchanges themselves.
Gotcha. So he's spending a lot of his time in Mississippi, trading between the exchanges. Was his background, Stan's background? I forgot. Was he?
He was math. He was math. Yeah, he studied math.
Okay.
Yeah.
By the way,
I think you still, a lot of quants.
Yeah, you probably still travel in those circles. What I'm trying to do on a very tangential topic is, we spend a lot of time in quantum. We invest in multiple quantum companies, and the advent of the quantum computer is going to create kind of a way to solve math problems that currently are unsolvable. My guess is some of these quants are trying to figure out, if they haven't already, what they're going to do with these quantum computers in order to use the ability to solve that new type of math to create new types of trades. that will give them a tremendous advantage over those who don't have access to a quantum computer. If when you're running your circles and you poke around and find anyone who is doing that and would like to talk about doing that, I would love to.
Absolutely.
Love to
I mean,
that.
I suspect with my experience in the past working with a ton of different trading firms, my guess is most of the guys are already looking at that. That
Yes.
seems to be, there's the technology used today, and then there's the technology you need to be prepared to use in the future. And I think in general, what I've seen is that the trading firms tend to be at the front end of that curve, pushing the technology, for basically technology that comes out of the labs and universities. They tend to be some of the first guys to use it, and the cutting edge, everything from cutting edge hardware, switches, FPGAs, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I was, and we'll come back to Dan's story in a second. I was listening to Acquired podcast a while back, and they did an episode about Rentec.
Yes.
And one of the things they speculated in the Rentec episode is it possible that Rentec kind of discovered how to use Gen AI before Gen AI
that
really
was a
happened,
term, yeah.
and they were making money off that for a period of time. And I haven't heard that confirmed, but they were certainly speculating that.
Well,
that
if
very
you
might have
read,
been the case.
so I've read Jim Simon's book that came out a few years back, and that is a great book. And I had some of the same thoughts when you look at the stuff they were doing with big data back in the 70s and 80s. It's amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's over the years, because I came from the telco side to understand the trading side, I've tried to read a lot of books that kind of helped open my eyes a little bit, and Jim Simon's was definitely one of the books that did that.
Great. Good. So let's go back to the how the revelation of I'm going to build a fiber network started, and then what you learned about the funding.
And so I think we should, if we can, we should ask Dan that question from the outside.
we haven't gotten him yet, but
Okay.
we'll keep an eye and see if we're able to catch him.
From the outside, right? As I understood it, he recognized the opportunity, and there was an opportunity to go and build a purpose-built network for this application. Mm-hmm. And I think this was around the 2008, maybe even 2007 time period, and so when you're looking,
so about the same time Zayo started,
yeah,
when Flash Boys started. And I should also point out, as we get into this, many of the people listening to this will know this, but many probably don't. This is Michael Lewis, like the Michael Lewis, who wrote the book Flash Boys, to describe kind of everything we're going through right now. There also was a movie made. My guess is they weren't able to work out the rights with either Michael Lewis for Flash Boys or maybe with the owners of Spread Networks. So the movie had to be called something else and was based on history, but had the element of fiction so that they could, I guess, tell the story without.
Yeah, they switched up the
infringing.
locations. Instead of New York to Chicago, it was Kansas City to New York, I believe. And of course, you're talking about the Hummingbird Project.
Yes.
The movie with Jesse Eisenberg and a great Skarsgård. It was a great, great actors were in that movie. In fact, at Zayo, we had a party in New York, right, or a showing where we invited customers and show it. I actually missed that.
Okay.
Because I think I was traveling somewhere else at the time and couldn't be there. And I heard that the movie didn't kind of match what really went on. So it was like 2 years before I saw that movie. I finally saw that movie when I was on a overseas flight, I think, to Europe. And I was, I'd done all my reading and all this, and I was bored, and I saw it was on there. I was like, I need to watch this. And it ended up being so much fun. The movie, I enjoyed the movie. Wasn't the greatest movie of all time, but it was a good movie. But the reason I enjoyed it way more than I expected was because it brought up so many memories of being with Dan and David and the stories of the things that happened during the building of the network, and that movie kind of touched on. And, it's not like the movie represented it perfectly. It just sparked memories that were similar to things that happened in the movie.
It's unfortunate, I think, for, certainly I'll say for all of us, me in the tiniest ways, but certainly everyone who was directly involved with Flash Boys, that the movie wasn't called Flash Boys.
Yeah.
And that the network wasn't called Spread Networks. And that the characters weren't the real characters.
Yeah.
Whatever business decision led to that is unfortunate, but boy, think about what that movie would have been like if it was Flash Boys.
Yeah, it was
How
a little
crazy would
more
that
because
have
there
been?
was enough real stories, I think, that that would have made for a great movie as well.
Yeah. So sorry to get you off on a tangent.
No worries,
So,
no worries. So we were talking about Dan and how he came up with the idea, and again, I think we'd have to hear from him the exact genesis of it. But what I heard, right, is that he decided, hey, there was a great opportunity, other than the trading he was doing, to basically arbitrage the telecommunication networks and create a network that was dedicated to a single purpose.
Mhm.
And so, if that's when he met the Barksdales. And that's when they kicked off the spread project.
Any stories about how he convinced the Bark? Because it's kind of a harebrained idea.
Yeah.
I'm going to build a direct network from New York to Chicago for trading, and they must be like, "What are you talking about? How much is this going to cost? And what do you know about building networks?"
Yeah, and I'm sure all of that went on. I was not in the room then, so I don't have any specifics on that. But I can give you a flavor because we used to talk about Dan. I don't know I'm sure if you didn't read, you know about the Walter Isaacson book on Steve Jobs.
Mhm.
And they talked about how Steve had the reality distortion field or something like that, right? We used to talk about Dan in the same way. When he got going with a passion on something, the rest of us in the company, it was a fairly small company, right? There was about 7 of us in kind of leadership positions, and then about 35, 40 guys in the field running the network and keeping it going and fixing it. And so, when Dan got excited about something, it was hard not to believe him.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I assume that his power of persuasion helped. And I think they saw the value and the opportunity.
And where was he at in building out the network when you first began your conversations with him?
So I started talking to him when he was building the network. I didn't know it at the time. So he was extremely secretive in building it out. Like, they used multiple different construction crews. They would just know they were building this 20 kilometers or this 50-kilometer stretch going from some random city in Pennsylvania to some random city in Ohio, not knowing anything about the end goal.
So why was he so secretive?
Because he was afraid that someone like you, I think, would figure it out and try and do the same thing, either try and beat him in latency or hop onto the right of ways, right? When you're building something, you can throw some extra duct in there or something. So he wanted to make sure, because the key was to have exclusivity on the fastest route.
Yeah.
And so that ultimately is why he was secretive. Like, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, when I was at Siena first talking with him, of course we had to do a mutual NDA. I think I had to sign a personal NDA as well to kind of have discussions with him.
Yeah, because his reason to be secretive, it was multifaceted. One is just if someone who had right of way along the route learned how important the direct route is, they could have held out for a big payment. It could have been a fiber rival who said, "Wow, I never thought of that. What a great idea. Maybe we should do something similar," either to try to beat him to that race, redo our current network, or even from a customer standpoint, the kind of customers that he wanted to serve. There was, part of the value of the network was if very few of the customers had access to it, the amount of value to those customers would be much, much higher than if a lot of customers were given access to it. So how to play out that strategy and how to do it where you had a big information advantage. And I guess the fourth one too would be you probably didn't really want to advertise it with would-be regulators that this was going to be used to create a trading advantage between kind of 2 points of trade, so that really smart mathematicians and traders could make money by seeing things in the market that were otherwise invisible to others. So there was multiple very important reasons for him to keep this as secretive as possible.
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the first few. It was all about making sure that the customers didn't hear, making sure that other carriers didn't hear. And, on the regulation side, I feel like over history, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but if you look at history, right, there was teletype, there was telecommunications, there was computers. there was pigeons and smoke signals before that. There's always an information advantage for getting information more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that itself has never been, something that's been too contested. It's more about, hey, making sure that it's something that, that you can deliver to customers and, extract the value of what was a very expensive, difficult project to build.
Yep, absolutely. So you got involved as he was where in that build out?
So I didn't know at the time, but he had already started construction. I started talking with him in kind of the summer of 2009. And so they were, I think, knee deep in construction at that point. He was talking to me because he was looking at ways to light the network and making sure he could light it the fastest. And I just remember having so many conversations with him and Michael Strickland, who was the CTO.
Mm-hmm.
And they were looking at
and Michael Strickland, who was the CTO, had a history at, I think it was level 3 prior to that.
Broad wing. I think it was level 3, broad wing, and then back to level 3.
Yes.
And so he, their entire focus was latency. So they were taking all the features of the latest and greatest WDM lasers that light the internet, and they wanted to basically turn it all off and make it super simple and dumb, and turn off all the error checking and the things that makes it more reliable in order to reduce the latency.
So just to kind of maybe raising that up a little bit. So
Thanks.
the idea was you wanted the fastest route to and from New York and Chicago in order to create a window of time where you had access to information that others didn't. And obviously, the greater the delta between your time and others, the more you could extract value out of that. So one of the innovations, as you were just taking us through, was, okay, let's look at the equipment that we would buy off the shelf from Ciena. Let's look at the insides of that equipment, what all is in there, and let's decide which of those features we really need, are essential, versus which, for our application, just slow down the signal. So we could get rid of them, we could turn them off. I mean, no one does that. I mean, I can't think of another application that I've ever heard of to this date that innovation was part of what they did. So,
and I still distinctly remember, because I think I was arguing with Dan, saying, well, we can turn down the error correction and that'll improve the latency a little bit, but we have to leave it on. This won't work without it. And I distinctly remember him saying, the number one focus is latency. The number 2 focus is latency. The number 3 focus is latency. So turn it all off and improve the latency. Yeah. And in the end, the Ciena engineers did it. And we worked with, at the time, Spread was working with a number of hardware vendors, and they all basically constructed what in the end we called a flying gas can, because it was the bare minimum to get the bits between A and Z, between Chicago and New York, with the data still getting there, but no extra margin whatsoever.
Yep. And whose equipment did they end up using? Was it Ciena's?
We used there was basically 3 vendors that ended up used in the network. It was Adva, Ciena, and Infinera. All 3.
Why all 3?
Because we let our customers choose what they wanted to use for initially we were just selling fiber. And so different customers had different relationships and different focuses. So in the end, they were all very close in latency. And some people were willing to give up a little bit of latency for a little more bandwidth and that sort of thing.
Gotcha. So the network's being built. What were some of the war stories from the building of the network that would raise questions about it taking longer, maybe never getting done, maybe cost overruns? I mean, that must have been a very stressful process, knowing that if we don't get this network done, and if it isn't the best latency, we've just spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and we've accomplished absolutely nothing. What were some of the
some of the classic ones where there was a few folks that, I don't think they found out the purpose of it, but they, for various reasons, didn't want us digging under their land, and so they were holding out. Some of them for more money, most of them not for that. They just said, no, we don't want, we don't trust you. We don't know what you're doing under the ground. I mean, this is in the middle of nowhere places in the Allegheny Mountains and elsewhere where some people just said, I don't want your money. I don't want your line going through. And for us, it would take time and latency to go around. So that's where David and the team did an amazing job at negotiating and getting it done.
Mm-hmm.
There's one story that we laughed about a lot, which is and I'll generalize it a bit. So there was a town in Pennsylvania where we were going under the city, and like a worst case scenario happened. So I don't know if you heard this story, but we ended up hitting a sewer line as we were trenching underneath a house.
Yes.
And it happened to be the mayor of the town who'd given us permission to get the right of way right before his daughter was getting married in their home.
Oh, yes.
So I'm pretty sure we ended up buying a pretty nice destination wedding while their house was being cleaned up and repaired. So yeah, that was, and there was a bunch of things like that happened over the construction.
Jake, I don't think you were with us after we did the deal and bought Spread Networks, which we'll get to. My wife and I went down to Jackson, Mississippi, and we had a great dinner with both the Barksdales and with Dan. And I think they told that story during the dinner. They were telling all of the kind of war stories of the Spread Networks. My memory is we were at a mall and a restaurant within the mall that the Barksdale either owned the mall property or owned that and the restaurant, and always meant to go back and do follow up that dinner. We said, we're going to be coming back. And, we never got the opportunity to do so, but it was one of the very few deals we did where I went that out of the way to go do a closing dinner just out of respect and admiration for what they built at Spread.
Yeah. And I didn't realize what an outsized role that Jackson, Mississippi plays in telecom history until I read it in your book and saw time and again. It's funny. Why do you think that is? I didn't realize it wasn't just McCaw and Spread, obviously. It was there was
Bernie Evers.
Yeah, exactly. So
I don't know if it was
why was
anything
that?
other than coincidental. I mean, Tulsa played a big role as well. Omaha played a big role, and there it was because there was a pipeline company and a construction company, but Jackson, I don't know why.
Yeah.
It might have been more coincidental than anything else.
It's just funny and I feel like that I also, got to hear stories in your book because when I started in telecom, it was in the .com boom. So I had spent a lot of time in school, grad school, studying optics, physics, and I got out. I got into the workforce, into telecom, right like at the peak in literally in the year 2000. So everything like. At the time, Alcatel was hiring, 5,000 people a month or something like that. And then it was only 2 years later, a year and a half later, where it was they were letting go 10,000 people a week.
Because the equipment companies, the optic wavelength companies, were among the biggest of the booms.
Yeah.
I mean, Sienna, I think, was one of the most valuable companies, I think, in the world for a short period of time.
Yeah, well, I think they had the biggest IPO in '98, I think.
Yeah.
At the time.
Crazy.
And so it was, I kind of jumped in when everything was crazy, and so I got to work with MCI and a lot of different people, but I didn't really have the background until I read in your book. I feel like I've always, in my different roles, I've always wanted to understand more background and context, and I wish that something like this would have existed. But I think you need the time to go by to be able to kind of see the forest for the trees.
Exactly. So maybe take us through your first sales call at Spread Networks. So now you have to learn a different customer base, right? Because now your customers are, maybe list these very specialized trading firms.
Yeah. So all the big prop shops, I think.
And prop shops mean
proprietary trading shops. So we talk to the banks and the proprietary trading shops.
And the proprietary trading shops means they're trading largely their own money. They have their own kind of typically fortune that they built up through trading.
Many times it's guys that left the banks, that were traders of the banks, left the trading banks. And without going into specifically, who the customers were, I think if you just, do a search of who the big trading firms is, you see guys like Citadel and Jump and Hudson River Trading, Tower, and those kind of guys. So, it was the typical usual suspects that we were talking to.
And they typically were either in Chicago or in New York, not always.
Correct.
But that's where
super majority were in those two locations. There was a few, like there was one in Kansas City. There were some in London. There were some in Amsterdam. But yeah.
And one in Jackson.
That's right. So yeah, I think the initial meeting, since Dan was a trader, he was very clear. We are not going to go during trading hours because we want the traders, the people who were responsible for ultimately making the decision and who owned the P&L. We wanted to make sure we could talk to them. And so often we would have the meeting at like 6 a.m. in the morning, Central Time, so that we'd have plenty of time to talk before they had to turn their focus to the trading day.
Yep.
So, and the reactions were across the board. Everyone was very curious. We had to get a very strict NDA in place first before we would even talk about it. So usually it was a lot of back and forth around that just to even set up the meeting.
Sure.
But then when we got there, the reactions, I'd say, were all over the place. There was always curiosity, wanting to understand more than we were usually willing to say. Two, understanding who the hell we were, because we were not a telecommunication carrier. They expect this from level 3, from someone, from AT&T, Verizon, something like that, but not from a random group of guys from Mississippi, from Jackson, Mississippi. Some of the conversations were a bit hostile. They sometimes were like, they didn't want to hear it. They were suspicious. They, in the end, we were asking for the value of what we had put in the ground and the value that it provided for their trading. So it was not inexpensive. It was $300,000 a month on and if you paid it up, that's if you paid $10.8 million up front, that would get you 5 years. If you paid $300,000 a month times 36 months, same $10.8 million, but you could pay it monthly.
Yeah, so maybe a little business lesson there that you touched on. So we all learn in business school when we take a course on marketing that you price for value. You don't price as a markup of cost, you price for value. If your value is less than your cost, you have a big problem. You shouldn't be selling the product. But if your value is a lot higher than your cost, you shouldn't constrain the pricing based on your cost structure. What you learn in business, particularly maybe in telecom business, which grew out of being a regulated monopoly, is that concept, as simple and as basic as it sounds, is not how most people price. Most people price by studying their costs and deciding what kind of margin is appropriate, and that, lo and behold, that's the price. And if you try to have conversations about value, so often it is such a difficult conversation. It's like people don't want to go there. It's foreign to them. You guys were incredible in terms of the discipline of we've got something so unique, so special, and so hard to replicate. It would take, at best, years for someone to replicate by the time you built it. But even then would be hard to replicate. It'd be hard to, you did it in a way where it'd be hard for someone to even match kind of the speed that you guys were able to achieve over a fiber network. So you recognize that, and you spend a lot of time thinking about what's not just the right way to price it, but who are the right customers to pay the highest price, and what are the right number of customers, and then how do you even kind of differentiate your product into more than one category so that you could create different pricing tiers based on performance. So talk to us more about that. Was Dan kind of the brainchild behind that?
He was. He was certainly the brainchild around the value for it. It was a discussion around the leadership of the company. But ultimately, I distinctly remember Dan saying, when we were talking about the price, it's not. He said, it's not too expensive if they're willing to pay the price.
Yes.
And I think his language was maybe a little more colorful than that, but that was the gist of it. And so ultimately we had to pick a line in the sand, and we did. And I think, over time it was, you always wonder if you would have priced it a little less expensive, would you have gotten more customers? If you price a little bit more, would you have gotten the same number? In the end, I think it was a good choice.
That was a great choice.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Yep.
I mean, first few deals paid for the whole network.
Yep. It worked out quite well. And ultimately, though, I felt like it was a group decision. Like there were times, we've seen other carriers do things like Dutch auctions and other things that really leave some people out, or it just didn't. In the end, Jim Barksdale, as our chairman, he has a lot of integrity, and he wanted to make sure that whatever we did, it was an even playing field for everyone that wanted to buy it. So, as long as you were willing to pay the price, you could get the service. There were times where some folks came up and said, "Hey, could we pay you a lot to have exclusivity even for a time?" And we decided, through Jim and Dave and Dan's leadership, that no, we were going to pick the price and stick to it.
Really, you didn't offer exclusivity for
Nope.
periods of time?
Nope.
Right,
It was, and that was because of that. Really was because of the Barksdale's leadership. And I think there were many times that I remember during the sales process that it taught me a lot. I aspire to have that integrity, and it was nice to see, the positive aspects of it. Like one example I remember is we were with one firm who no longer exists, but we were meeting with the owner of the company, and we heard this question a lot once they got past the initial facts of what is it, what is latency, what is the price, what is the commitment. The next question was, who are you? Are we sure you're not going to disappear off to pick your island of choice after we give you the money, especially paying up front? I think, Bahamas was popular. Turk and Caicos, I think, was the most common.
So it sounded like you at least thought about going to Bahamas.
Yes.
Or Turkey.
So the best response was when Jim was in one of those meetings, and he basically said, "I'm putting my name on the line, and my name is worth more to me than this deal we're doing here." And every time that just ended the question and ended the conversation. And so, time and time again, I saw that the integrity of our owners that trickled down to how we operated the company was super important in the success of the company.
Yeah. So how, on the first deals that you would end up doing,
Mm-hmm.
those are very lucrative deals. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I guess lucrative is a relative term, but certainly you were, in your very early commercial deals, you were already collecting enough money to pretty much pay for the cost of the entire network. If I remember the story correctly, there was, a huge and a quick return. Roughly, do you remember roughly how much it costs to build out that network?
I think what's published in the book is somewhere around 200-300 million.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is actually, for building a network between New York and Chicago, that's pretty efficient build too.
Yeah.
It's one thing we learned at Zayo from companies we acquired, was if you really understand kind of from a business perspective what you're building and where you're building it, and you have passionate people on the ground who are looking for every way to kind of save time and save money, you get things built a lot quicker and a lot less expensively than if you just, it's a construction project, I'm going to turn over to a construction firm, or we have a construction management department at our company, we turn over to them and they go, and get the job done. That's far different than a business ownership mentality in building out a route. And, that was your guys' business, building out a route, and let's get the job done, but let's spend no more than we need to spend.
Yeah, you nailed it. And we found, I think, again, it came down to the people. We had such a good group of folks. Steve Williams was running most of our construction side, and he did an amazing job at just that. And, I can think down through the leaders. We've talked about Jim and David and Dan, and of course, Michael Strickland, but Tim Goff, who ran operations, he also brought so much. He was a Naval Academy grad, fighter pilot and helicopter pilot, and he ran a tight ship with operations. And I think that's something that not a lot of people besides the users of the network in the initial years appreciated, that it was extremely reliable. And he made sure, I still remember, like 3 weeks in, we kept having some of our techs go in and adjust things during the trading day, and they'd bump a fiber and it would bring a customer down for a short time, and we'd hear from the customers. And so we eventually put up signs, don't go in during the trading day, and we made restrictions of that. And ultimately someone kept going in and ignoring those signs. And it seems kind of harsh in today's world, but I think the second time he went in during trading, he was shown the door, and no one ever went in to the cabinets during the trading days after that. And it was that kind of tight ship that Tim ran.
Yeah, I'm going to go off another tangent here, and maybe if you're listening to this and you're part of the current Zayo or the current Lumen, this might be worth paying a little extra attention to. So I was long struggling with this notion that telecom companies that achieved great scale, meaning they were active in a lot of geographies, and telecom companies that achieved great scope, meaning they offered a whole suite of products to a whole bunch of customers, that on paper, they should have a huge advantage, scale and scope advantage. Yet time and time again, very focused companies would run circles around them. And so I came up with this kind of thought piece that I shared in various forms, including writing it out in a blog that was called the Scope and Scale Paradox. Meaning, why is it that small companies that are seemingly disadvantaged by scale, lots of geographies, and disadvantaged in scope because they did one or only two things, yet they seem to do much better for their investors by a lot than those who are trying to do lots of things for lots of customers. And you guys were obviously a prime example of that. And what I came to is because if you're super focused, you are able to have such a tight relationship between kind of the costs, the capital program, the operations, through to the sales, through to the pricing, and making sure that what you're really doing for your customers is based on so much more knowledgeable at the point of attack and how to deliver a great result. And the big guys can never even figure out what you're doing. So we went down a path at Zayo of saying, okay, we want to have big scale, we want to have scope, but we don't want to have our lunch eaten time and time again by small guys. So how do we do both? And came up with the idea of we need to break things down into these business units that had much more firm control of their costs. Well, in the telecom world, that's so anti what traditional telecom is. What traditional telecom is, well, geez, if you're in the network, doing anything in the network, you're part of the network organization, which means almost all of the people, almost all of the expenses, and almost all of the capital program is controlled not by business people, but by someone running the network. So they could declare that they're doing a great job. Who would know any better? There's no way of measuring kind of what their great job is. When we bought Spread, as an example, we didn't do that. We didn't take kind of the great operations people you just mentioned and the engineers you mentioned and say, okay, you guys are operations people. You go in the operations organization. You guys are spending capital. You go in the people who spend capital organization. We said, we're going to create a business unit. I think we even called Spread Networks by Zayo. I don't know when they abandoned that name, but throughout at least my tenure, it was Spread Networks by Zayo. You guys operate, within the context of Zayo. You get the benefit of the broader assets where you can find ones that were valuable, but you go operate your business, and we'll keep track of all your costs, all your revenue, and how that translates into value creation. And you guys stay, together as a focused team. It was one of the, other people look at that and say, how crazy is that? How inefficient? And the answer was, it worked.
It absolutely did. And I'm with you 100%. Focus, I think, is the key thing. And in no matter what you're doing, no matter what the industry is. I think, I always thought of your acquisition of Spread, of you acquired basically the simplest, in some ways, the dumbest telco ever, because what telco had a single point A to point Z route? Mm-hmm. That was got to be the only one that had that small of a network. Mm-hmm. Even though it was large in length, it was a single bloody route, right?
A single bloody route that was operating as a unique business. Yes. Others, you'd acquire a single route, but they were just, doing what others did, but only had a single asset to work with, and you would just roll that asset into a bigger context. But yours was a single route with a very specialized purpose, specialized customer base, unique pricing approach, unique value proposition. So the end-to-end business around that single route was compelling, not just because that route existed, but because of what you were doing with that route, which was very different than because we would acquire a company that would have a single dark fiber network in a single city. So you get kind of say, well, that's kind of analogous, but that was only asset that they had, but what they were doing with it was the same as someone who had a similar asset in another city.
Yeah, they might hit 300 pops in the city or something like that. Yeah. That's one question that I always had is spread was in some ways very different than the rest of your, 47 acquisitions during Zayo. I understood the value that I understand the value that you just described in spread and how we were very focused and how we did well at that focus. But you bought us 8 years after, right? And we haven't really kind of told more of the story about after the spread route, which was the fastest way to get between New York and Chicago, then people started building wireless routes. And so by the time you bought spread, wireless existed, kind of the value proposition had changed a bit. And so was there, I don't feel like you bought spread just for the low latency finance business side of it. Can you tell me more about, why you did and your team why did you buy spread? Was it more than that? And what were the other values?
Well, one of the big other values that we saw. So first of all, the difficulty of buying spread was that you weren't quite sure what you were buying because the average price per service was very high, but it was coming down for reasons that you just said. There were others chipping away at the uniqueness of the value prop using wireless routes, which had less capacity but could be lower latency, maybe less reliable because something could interrupt, weather, kind of the wireless signal at times. But that would make the fiber very valuable, but over very short periods of time. So how would the pricing evolve for the fiber route was unclear. So, how do you value that asset at that point? Even valuing it at kind of a relatively benign multiple of EBITDA wasn't clear because you're like, well, is that EBITDA going to hold true, or is that going to come down because pricing is going to come down? So are you catching a falling knife, or are you buying it at a good time? A lot of the value had already been extracted, collected, paid for the original route, but for the price we were paying, how did that compare to the value of what we were buying? It was very hard to tell. If you believe Dan, he was giving us the deal of our lifetime, but there was really
he was a good salesman as well.
Yeah. So it probably took 2 years for us to buy it because of back and forth on are they ready to sell? At what price would they sell it for? How about this price? Now talk 6 months later. How about that price? So there was a cat and mouse game, but they were getting ready to sell it, and they were worried too about what the future of just running that route would look like. Would it go underwater for them? So we did take a chance when we bought it, but part of what we wanted to do is say, well, part of what we're buying is the know-how of how to leverage unique routes. So what we just talked about, can we, out of all the assets we have, can clever people look at those and find some other unique routes, both unique routes for financial traders, but also the concept of what other sectors might value a very unique route where they would pay extra for something that is advertised as a special low latency route. And then secondly, could we leverage that customer base? So the customer base that Spread had a really close, cozy relationship, you in particular, when you had the availability of the broadness of what Zayo had, could you bring other things to those customers that we otherwise would never get? So it was a bet on, can we expand that, while the specific value for that route might still go down before it stabilizes, could you leverage the expertise into other existing assets to create new routes, and can you leverage that customer base? And you turned out to be a key part of us looking to do that. So you'll be able to tell us in a second kind of what it felt like from your perspective. But the other thing that is a problem with people learning how to price to value is when you have someone who's valuable, uniquely valuable, and he knows it. And for us to keep him, we have to pay him what he's worth. So I think you are one of the, I think it's safe to say, highest paid, if not the highest paid person in our sales organization, because you brought so much unique value to it. And
thank you.
So, and I think we gave you a lot of equity as well, as if my memory is correct, and I think you earned every bit of what that was. So, and I want to come back to the spread story itself before we bought it, but we'll return there. But what was it like when you joined Zayo? What did that feel like? How did that work out from your perspective?
Well, so when spread was selling to Zayo, right, we all had to kind of make decisions. What were our plans? And honestly, at that point, I'd been with spread for 8 years, selling, focused just on this financial services, low latency trading kind of space. And I felt like I was ready for something different. And I thought, let me go and do just general telecom. And but then we started talking, and I'll tell you, it was the best decision I ever made to stick to what I'd been focusing on. Again, going back to focus. And and I feel like at every company I've been at, we talked about some of the people and personalities at Spread, but I feel like every company I've been at, there's amazing people that have been willing to give and teach. I've learned from some that some that I've taught, and
many that you taught at Zayo.
Yeah,
I know you shared your expertise with a lot of people, including some up and comers.
Yeah,
and benefited from you being there.
Well, we can talk about that, but so the guys at Zayo that were really key, I felt like, were guys like Brandon Goen, Chase Boyle, Chaz Kramer, Todd McWhirter, right? These are guys that, accepted, and what I appreciated was the ability to just, I was in a playground of assets around the world that I could use to connect trading exchanges.
But all those guys, at least four to five, Todd, my memory's a little hazy with.
Yeah.
The other four, all great, Zayo team members.
And I'm just mentioning some. There's many more.
But those were very, I think those were very well chosen because they're all early in their career.
Yep.
They're all very ambitious and
smart,
and they learned a ton from you. And in fact, they would teach me a ton too. Some of which would come from you, and then I'd be curious, and I'd probe with those same guys. I learned. I think my first trade with Bitcoins was from Chase.
That's right, who now works at Coinbase.
Yes.
Yep. And I think you should have him on this podcast. He should have some great stories.
Oh yeah, I will have him on this podcast. Chase, I hope you listen to this. You're next.
So my initial memories of Zayo was kind of getting my hands around what assets you had that were unique. You had the leading assets to ICE, to the New York Stock Exchange, at their data center up in Mahwah. But it had not been a focus. Again, going back, I feel like that's going to be the theme of this discussion. And what that meant is sometimes it was sold for the value, and other times it was not. And there's one good story, and I'll make it super quick, where
we have plenty of time. These are long form podcasts.
Where a carrier had purchased dark fiber on the fastest routes to ICE, and I'm going to leave the guilty unnamed, but they had created a company name, and it was very close to an actual trading company name, but just like the last three, like instead of LLC, it was a C Corp or an S Corp or something, just a hair off. And apparently we at Zayo had sold it to them thinking they were a trading firm, but they had taken this fiber and lit a bunch of waves on it and were undercutting us. And I didn't know who it was. Therefore, you can't we don't know that they're not a trading firm. We think this is going on. We're hearing that there's cheaper services out that are the exact same latency, and latency is a fingerprint. You can't hide. If it's the same latency, it's the same route. And so ultimately what we did is we started looking at the checks. I looked at the scanned checks with the help of a few folks on the accounts payable and invoice team, and we looked, it was signed by the guy. The signature matched the person I knew in the industry that owned a telecommunication company. And so it allowed us to go and have a conversation and say, hey, it's been a good run, no mas. And so we kind of put a stop to that, and that, helped us, reap more of the value from the services, as well as build out other services using assets that already existed with a few, extra splices and tweaks to improve the routes.
Yeah. So let's talk about spooling cables.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you guys do that involves spooling cables as part of a service you delivered?
Well, in principle, it's super simple, and I think you already stated it, right? Latency, and we've been talking about latency, and we talked about how, New York, Chicago is 13 milliseconds round trip with the spread route, which was faster than any other route by milliseconds. And, and then we talked about how wireless, we mentioned briefly that wireless is faster, mainly because the speed of light, you don't have to study physics to have heard of the speed of light. And most people know one thing, that, the speed of light is a constant, c. But what you don't, the nuance is, it's a constant in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And the air, which is what wireless goes through, is basically a vacuum. But glass is 40% slower. So light is much, much slower than glass. So through the air, wireless, that is much faster, and that ended up being faster on most routes. And there's companies that focus on that, like the company that I worked for called McKay Brothers. They do a great job at building wireless networks. But on the fiber side, when we built the 13 millisecond spread route, we were so much faster, and we charged a premium. We were so much faster than the next fastest, that we wanted to, after we sold it to everyone who would buy it at the fastest latency, there were folks that said, we can't pay that amount, but we would love to be faster than the Verizon route. And we would pay more if you would give us something in the middle. So it was really, I don't think we were geniuses when it came to recognizing the need for it. We just listened to our customers.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it was, there's a lot of ways to slow things down. You can put in a switch, slow it down with a switch. You can use electronics, but the simplest way to do it. You
could build another extension of the route through.
That's right.
Which
You
would
could
be a
build
pretty expensive way to do it.
And I think it was Michael Strickland and Tim Goff and their team that came up with, hey, the simplest thing is just to run it through. And I think we had a fairly, for a simple idea of, you just add some additional length of fiber, right? Because it's basically the speed of light in fiber is around 5 nanoseconds per meter. So every meter is 5 additional nanoseconds. We wanted to add microseconds, so we're adding hundreds of meters of fiber. But with the end of, I think they even have a patent on a box that has multiple routes, and you can basically switch optically and choose what latency you want and send certain wavelengths and spectrum through certain. So we ended up, by the time it was said and done, over a period of 2 years, we created 4 different latency levels. Each one had a premium over the level beneath it. And that's how we were able to extract the maximum value out of the spread route.
Yeah, so basically the fiber would go through these big spools and be looped around. Now, if you want the fastest route, maybe it would go around once or not at all. If you want next fastest, it would go around a certain number of times. And that's how you would just, and make some routes faster than others.
Those were in the data center, so we had to lock those up. It was key to lock those up, because if you kept it unlocked, it would be easy for a customer to go in and, change a patch so that they could bypass it.
Yep. So you make it sound so friendly in the negotiations with the customers. I know some of the more difficult conversations that I got dragged into with customers were with these very same financial traders. And, they're, because of what they do for a living, they're probably high strung anyways. And quite often they would start really aggressive. Like, there is no way you're going to do an auction that forces us to pay higher than we need to pay for it. And I'm like, I don't think we would do that. And I would go to you or anyone else. I'm like, what are they talking about, an auction? I didn't know that even existed in this context. And you'd find out that they were preemptively trying to kind of give me some body blows as CEO to make sure, almost
soften you up.
Make me second guess what I might be being told by my team as to how much we should charge. So they would want to convince you, I hope you know this isn't as valuable as you probably think it is. In fact, it's a lot less valuable than we're paying for right now. We don't even know why we're paying this amount. In fact, we might not even continue. I'm like, why are these customers all over me about price when I'm just there to meet them?
Yeah, it was definitely a little different than your standard telco customer. And, to give them the benefit, the value of the latency completely depends on the trading strategy in the company and how they value it. So there really is a spectrum. That's ultimately why I think we ended up by the School of Hard Knocks creating 4 different latency levels, because it met the majority of the market demand. And there were people who got a lot of value about being faster than most, but not having the cost to be the fastest. So, again, for what customers were saying when they were telling you that, for some customers that was true. For other customers, I mean, this is why I enjoyed dealing with these customers, because they were smart. Like they were the smartest, and so many of them knew game theory and knew what they were very good at negotiating. So ultimately, I kind of had to go back to Dan's. It's not expensive if they're willing to pay for it, and sometimes you just had to say, "This is the price. Take it or leave it. If you don't want it, here's something slower. If you want cheaper, we have cheaper."
Yeah.
And that was, that's.
And sometimes, the adage of the louder they complain would make you be like, wow, maybe this is more valuable than.
Me thinks that he does protest too much. Yes.
Yes,
Yep,
exactly.
definitely.
There was definitely elements to that would come into play. So let's go back to before Zayo got involved and tell some, because there was how many years between when you were first operational and when Zayo bought it?
It was 8 years. So we launched on August 9th of 2010, and most of us remember that date because we were up till 4 a.m. delivering the services to customers to ensure they all got them at the same time, and no one had a timing advantage of having more time on the line or had time to bring it up before the markets opened in the morning. And then it closed in February of 18.
Okay, so in the very early time when you became operational, when did you start to realize how valuable in practice, so based on what you're hearing or be able to deduce from customers, how much money they're able to make by, this is not a word you're going to like, but kind of front running the other trades is basically what they would do. They would kind of see, and it's explained really well in this book. It's been a while since I've read it, but what would happen is they'd be able to see kind of demand at a certain stock price for a specific stock. Typically, these were indexes where they would focus because of the volume. So they would see kind of signals of buyers, for example, who were interested in a certain price. And you would see that as the trade was beginning to happen, and you'd be able to get in front of that trade. So you'd be able to buy at a slightly lower price and sell at a slightly higher price because there were buyers at a slightly higher price. And you would do that, over and over and over and over and over again. So pretty much on every trade that's happening, you're making a very small margin times a very large volume of trades with taking basically no risk, because you're seeing the trading activity before you're buying. You hold it for a very short amount of time, you sell it, and you rinse and repeat. That's probably a hatchet description of what was happening, but that's basically what the trade was.
Well, I mean, you're right. I don't like that term because I think that term has negative connotations. And I think ultimately, and let me start real quick and make a real quick one sentence. So I talked about how the first part of my career was working for hardware vendors for WDM lasers that lighted the internet. Second third of my career was working for service providers like Spread, Zayo, McKay Brothers. And I just started 2 weeks ago a job working for one of the trading firms. So I should be very clear that I now work for Hudson River Trading. And this whole conversation is really before that time, right?
Way before.
I'm not speaking for Hudson River. And
we're speaking a decade ago.
Yeah, I'm too new. I don't even know what I don't know at this point. But from my perspective back in the Spread days, right, it was, and I think that Michael Lewis book was a little bit controversial in the trading circles for that reason, for him using that term. And in fact, there's a counter book that's available out there called not so flash boys or not so fast flash boys. And it kind of gives the perspective from the trading world that I think ultimately is, hey, we're just getting information about price, right? Public information that the exchange releases about bid and ask prices. And we're just getting it to a different exchange where we can use that information to make intelligent trading decisions.
Yeah.
And whether it's on fiber, on wireless, Pony Express, whatever you can get it there the fastest.
Yeah, and that's what keeps the markets efficient, right?
Yep.
I mean, if the way markets stay on the cutting edge of efficiency is by clever traders kind of come up with the strategies that take advantage of the arbitrage, but as they take advantage of arbitrage disappears.
Yep.
Sometimes it takes
which ultimately
longer,
makes more efficient markets in the end.
Exactly. So there is a service being performed there that creates more efficient markets. It's just in this case, there was opportunity to make a lot of money over a period of time while the efficiency was slowly working its way into the service offering. So it's not to say they were doing anything even close to wrong or illegal. It was perfectly legal, and it was not wrong. It was, it was opportunistic. It was clever. It was entrepreneurial, and like you said, that is happening for as long as people did trades. Even before technology. And the way we think about technology existed. You use the smoke signal example. So there's nothing wrong with it. If you could train a bird to deliver a message more quickly than your enemy, you would have a military advantage. Same kind of idea.
Yeah, or the marathon runner was one of the first examples of information arbitrage.
That's right. That's why they call it the marathon. It was the city of Marathon, right, in Greece. And they would have really fast, long-distance runners because they needed to deliver messages efficiently from one city to another city. Yeah, that's right. Great analogy. All right, good stuff. So tell us, maybe you could change some of the names to protect the innocent, but tell us some fun stories from when you dealt with some of these traders. Or I think I started to ask, when you first started to realize, getting past the theory of if we build this network, it'll be efficient,
the value of it,
but
and
the actual stories of value being created by people you've
again, I think Dan knew the value of this better than any of us because he had been a trader and he recognized years before I got, before he came up with the idea of the network, got the funding for the network, built the network, and then I came in to help him sell the network.
But it was still theoretical until the network was
that's
operational.
True. That's
it was
true.
Still
it was
kind
theoretical.
Of hold your breath. Is this?
Yep.
It was really work?
That was the other thing that I think was unique about Spread is what startup in the telecom space had zero revenue one day, and let's just say hundreds of millions the next day. It was. I think that was very unique for Spread. Just the step function in how that happened, and I think the proof.
Hopefully, you had a good commission plan.
The proof in the pudding. Well, if you read that book, there's some comments in there that indicate otherwise. But no, I've been very fortunate and treated very well. Ultimately, the proof in the pudding was that there were people who said no before we launched and that called us back the week after we launched. So there was an initial tranche of people that wanted to be on when it went live, the second it went live. And from my perspective back then, I think some of it was offensive on the trading side, wanting to get faster, get the information first. Some of it may have been defensive, where they were didn't want someone else to get the information first, so they just, wanted to be equal. And, and others took a wait and see, and we had a second tranche in the few months after the launch where others kind of
How hard were those phone calls for others to make to you?
Well, they were a lot easier to take, trust me, right? Because once they call you and they're like, "Yep, will you come back and talk with us?" I think we were very fair in that we had a price, and that price was not negotiated. The price was the price, so everyone paid the same price back then with the initial dark fiber.
Yep.
And we delivered an excellent product that was operated. I still think today at Zayo, it is the best, highest reliable, best run long haul optical network, I think, in the industry. And that's part of the value. When I was asking you about why you bought Spread, I've got my own opinions. I think, the latency play was great, and the premium we got for it was great. It had changed by the time you bought it. It wasn't quite the same premium because much of that premium had gone to wireless networks. It still had quite a bit compared to a premium compared to your average fiber network, but a lot of the net premium had moved over to wireless. But I think some of the things that I saw in the years after we went live, so for the first 2 years, it was just head down, selling to traders, selling on the latency, creating the different latency tiers. And then after 2 years, we had kind of met the market. There was some growth as new companies were created. We really mainly lost people as companies, let's say, merged. But we were like, okay, we've extracted the latency value out of this. What are we going to do next? And that's where we had a lot of brainstorming, SWOT kind of brainstorming times with the Barksdales and the rest of the company. And ultimately, what we learned, and again, I don't feel like, like a lot of things, you learn from your customers and you learn by just listening and paying attention and focusing. We kept getting calls from Google and Amazon and Facebook, and they wanted the route because the fact that we did not hit all the major cities because we wanted to be straight meant it was very diverse from every other fiber network between the 2 biggest cities in the country and on the way to the 3rd biggest city down up to San Fran and eventually LA, right? Yeah. So it was a great cross-country route.
It's funny you asked why we saw value in it. I forgot one of the most important reasons is we didn't own a network between Chicago and New York. We leased fiber. I don't know I can't remember if it was on a Verizon route or on a level 3 route, but Zayo grew not by constructing our own routes. We grew by acquiring companies. And then we had to, when we started seeing the value of owning our own fiber networks between cities, not just fiber networks, we had to look around and say, okay, what fiber networks are there to acquire? Where we own the right of way, we own the conduit, we own the fiber cable itself, and there weren't very many things to own between New York and Chicago that weren't already in the hands of the biggest providers. In fact, that was probably the only asset that you could acquire. So that alone probably made the route worth a ton more to us than the spread. So in hindsight, when I take that into account, and I'm sure there's been countless dark fiber deals that have been sold since then that have included fiber on the route between New York and Chicago. So Zayo's extracted enormous value on that route.
That makes perfect sense because what we started doing after, let's say, the 2nd or 3rd year is we started talking to the content guys who were building fiber networks all over. Those conversations weren't easy either because they liked the lower latency because they cared about response time of their services. They wanted to make sure that our cat videos didn't have any lag. And so they cared about the latency, and we had to have very hard conversations with, again, very similar to the trading customers, very smart, very experienced people at Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, et cetera, that said, well, we'd like to buy this dark fiber, but we don't want you to put spools on it. And we're like, well, we won't put spools on it, but then you can only use it for proprietary trading, not for anything else. And you can't put any customer data on it. And of course, they don't trade, and all they have is basically customer data. And so eventually, after many of them, a couple of years of back and forth, they finally accepted that if they wanted the route, they had to have the spools. And so we added that in. And then we were working with carriers as well. I remember talking to Zayo, I think starting in those early years for many years, and other companies, and I think the advantage that you just described of Zayo being able to monetize that route is the fact that, all we had was New York, Chicago. So if someone wanted to get from, New York to San Fran, they would have to deal with Zayo and Spread at the time before you acquired Spread. So post-acquisition, it was a key part. That makes perfect sense of the overall puzzle of getting around the entire country.
Yeah, so you brought whenever I have these discussions, it brings up memories.
Yeah.
So we were, as Zayo, only learning about the value of building unique routes. And I can't remember how much we did before spread or if a lot of this was sparked as a result of spread. And it could have even been a result of spread before we bought it, but understanding the spread story. But what we end up doing is building very unique routes, working with typically we'd call them the hyperscale or web scale back then, but the big tech companies. We'd understand where they were trying to get to, what would be the lowest latency way to get there, because they cared about that connecting up their data centers, and how to create the route that was unique from the other routes. So, avoid crossing them, avoid being on the same right of way as them. But then you had to get into, okay, how do you price for those routes? And I remember a lot of battles within the four walls of Zayo where particularly the sales organization that would work with the web scale, they would, be arguing on behalf of their customers. And what they would hear their customers say is, we don't want differentiated pricing. We want the same price per fiber, no matter where we buy the fiber. And we're not going to buy from you unless we get that. And we'd be like, okay, well, you're going to have to, respectfully explain to them that no, if we build a very unique route, it has a very unique value, and we can't think of that as a price per unit of fiber, regardless of where geographically it is. They're going to have to talk to us about specific routes, and it would, create tension at times, both within the organization and with the customers. But for the salespeople who would get that, it'd be good for them, because now they would have something that they could sell at a big premium, and they would make more money. So it was an interesting kind of cat and mouse game, not always as pleasant as I would like it, but trying to work with the teams to say, why are you pricing it that way? Became kind of something somewhat unique to Zayo, because the other telecom companies they didn't do that. They didn't have the experience of you guys, by us buying spread. But we would do that, and we would break the organization down into geographies. We would, within the geographies, we had business leaders who would spend a lot of time understanding what of their network they had that was of unique value, and how do you extract the value out of that. And it was kind of a puzzle that we had multiple great leaders show how to do that. And I know you worked with Derek and with Tony,
Yes.
Tony Gervais, who was
Yep.
big in the financial. Derek was huge in the financials, and you guys would constantly be thinking about how do we, create value for the financial by using kind of network assets we had and make them more special to that segment.
Absolutely, and it wasn't just in the finance space, right? It
Yep.
was across all markets. If you have something unique that has value, that is, and to know that, you have to know the market, right? You have to know your competitors. You have to know everything that's out there, and you have to understand your customers and what they're doing with it. So I think that's what I saw the growth at Zayo as we worked on those stories and worked with the different folks. And you know how it is, some folks in the company got it, glommed onto it, and did an amazing job at building other routes. Like I remember while I was there's some new routes from Atlanta to DC, down to Ashburn as well, and others that kind of took those same principles. And others, who didn't have the focus, then there was, then you're stuck just kind of competing on price or something like that.
Yep. And when did you end up leaving Zayo?
I left Zayo in 22. So after you left.
Yeah, so a couple years after
Yeah.
I left, and I'm still own a pretty material piece of Zayo. Maybe not material to them, but certainly material to me, and still keep in close contact with people there. And they've gone to a more traditional organization structure where they've got a network organization, which is where most people work for, and that controls all the big spending of money. And I do look at that and wonder how much of what we took so much effort to build in terms of really understand your assets, understand them down to the route, down to the building, know what's kind of a Me Too building that you can pretty much buy service from 8-10 different companies versus very unique buildings and very unique routes between buildings. And how do you differentiate pricing? How do you get people on the ground, business people, to understand that and have an incentive to? And most of that got blown up post the acquisition. And I'll never know, but how much value was lost because of that, or did it not really matter that much? I don't think there's any way people would know.
I mean, I think some of the people that we just talked about still, some of the guys that learned those lessons with us are still there doing that.
But most of them are.
But a lot of people are off spread. I mean, this is something that, and you mentioned this, I think towards the end of your book, where you talk about the fact that, and I don't think you use these words, but how I think of it is Zayo really seeded the industry with folks all over the industry now grew up at Zayo. And especially because Zayo was a very, when I joined, when was 2018, was what, 7 years ago. And, it was a very young company, right? It had a lot of folks that was their first job in telecom. And now they're running companies literally all over the world.
Yes.
Right? Noah's
doing great stuff.
He's over in Singapore, and there's people all over. And it's been, like I said, I've been very fortunate that I feel like every company I've been in, I just get to deal with some amazing people, and you quickly find who the folks are that are willing to spend time with you, teaching you. And then on the other end of it, as I'm getting closer to the end of my career than the beginning, the folks that want to learn, and you talk to some, and you never know who's going to be the ones that are going to be willing to teach you, and you never know who are the ones that are going to be willing to learn. Like some of the few things I think, oh, this is going to be great, they're going to learn all this, they're not interested, and others come and so you talked about, I think, how you have rightfully some pride in what you created in Zayo has now seeded the industry. And I feel like to a much lesser degree, right, there's a lot of folks now that are in the finance side of telecom at different companies that I worked with at Zayo and really enjoyed working with.
Yeah, I want to talk about the finance side in a second, but let's first focus on, there's multiple people who came up through Zayo who are doing exactly what we're talking about. They're taking unique assets because they acquired them, or in many cases, unique assets because they build them. They collaborate with the customers real closely, just like you were describing, and they're building businesses from the ground up, providing very unique services and unique in the form of what route, why they building it, who they building it for, then how do you leverage that with adjacent customers? And there's, I don't want to start rattling off names, but
there's a lot of them.
There's 6, 8, 10 names that immediately come to mind, and they're scattered all over the place. So that's fun. But then you mentioned finance people. The other thing we did, and this is one where I laugh about it, but it was painful at the time. We had a lot of people whose jobs were finance, and it was operational finance, and they were largely decentralized because they would be put together with these people we described, who owned a geography, owned a certain type of business unit,
a different P&L all over.
Exactly, and they would be the ones, helping to make sense of the math relative to, if you do this, so invest to build out this network, combine it with the existing network, price a certain way for a certain type of customer. Look, you can make a good return out of it. So one of the first things that the new investors did when they did their diligence and bought Zayo was like, we're going to bring efficiency to the finance organization. We're going to bring all those people together, have a centralized boss, and cut 2/3 of them. I'm like, okay, we'll see how much value that creates. And certainly it went, at least in my opinion, that wasn't a very smooth move. But those people have then scattered across the industry, took that knowledge, matched up with those business leaders we described, and they're doing what they learned to do at Zayo in these other environments, which is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, for how large Zayo was, I think when I joined, was it 3,000-ish? Does that sound right-ish for 2018? You gave so much autonomy to so many young people in the industry, and that's where I think at the end of your book, right, you have some of the principles, and and it's more than EBITDA. I think Zayo is where I learned the term MOIC, right? And so it was. For me,
multiple of invested capital.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It was because again, my background, I'm a telecom geek. I studied physics and optics. For me, the business side, I learned a lot.
When did you study physics?
What's that?
When did you study physics?
So I did my undergrad and graduate school in physics.
Okay, so that made you very uniquely qualified for this specific.
I think so. That's probably why I enjoy it, because a lot of the folks in the trading industry, right? They're mathematicians, physicists, coders, and so I felt like I could speak their language and understand. And but my career had gone a different direction. My first job out of school was on staff at Alcatel, doing working in the lab, doing technical things. and it was a lot of fun, but it was also, for my personality, I found by the time the clock hit 3 o'clock, I was starting to nod off. And then over a multi-year period after the dot bomb, when I got laid off at Alcatel and started consulting for other firms, I kind of transitioned from, like many people in telco, right? I feel like, well, you're mechanical engineering, right?
Yes.
And my son is mechanical engineering here at Mines, right around the corner from here.
Oh, fantastic, yes.
And so a lot of us, I feel like in telco, kind of stumbled into it from an engineering kind of background because we're attracted to technology and data. And for me, that transition went from the technical staff to kind of systems engineering to sales engineering. Then I was working at a startup where the head sales guy was kind of your stereotypical sales guy, and he was at the bars instead of with the customers, and so he was.
I like that.
He was let go, and I was Drake. You go. You know the customers. You've been working with the sales guy. You figure it out. And then they hired a new head of sales, and the head of sales said the best thing to me, I think, in my career is like, you need to choose. You can either keep doing engineering or I'll teach you how to do sales. And so that's kind of how my career went in that direction. But I think having the technical background has helped. And
for certain.
It also,
in your case, yeah.
It also helps that, I care about understanding the application and about the customer. And it's, I think it allowed me to have the big picture of, hey, it's not about any one sale. It's about understanding the market and the problem and the best solution for the long term.
Let's, and I think there's something that's safe to talk about. Give us your vision about AI in the context of kind of networks. So right now with Gen AI, most of what you hear about is these big, data center environments with lots of GPUs in them that do a lot of learning. Within the four walls of a data center. They have to be connected with fiber, but most of what matters is happening within the data center. What leaves the data center environment, is a fraction of what's going on in the data center environment. But as AI begins to proliferate, there's going to be more that goes on at the edge. People are using the word inference as kind of what would happen in a more distributed standpoint. So how have you put any thought into kind of how AI and networking kind of will play out?
I've seen on the on the GPU farm side, right, that drive, because you have to feed the GPUs with data, right? So I've seen that in terms of centralizing huge amounts of power and need for huge amounts of bandwidth to those same locations. But I feel like that's just a logical conclusion of what data centers had become pre Gen AI.
Yeah, but latency doesn't really play that much of a role because you're feeding the data in it.
Yeah.
Ton of data.
It's not a latency play. It's a bandwidth play in general for that. I don't know a ton about this, Dan. I feel like that for me, Gen AI it's kind of like we've seen these waves in telecom, right? We saw the cloud wave, and all of them are all just iterations on machine learning, right? On using machines to do more than they used to do before, machines being computing machines. And so, I feel like this is just the next logical step in it. And, every step has added both more centralized compute and moving stuff more to the edge.
Yep. And I've got to envision that there are clever minds out there who do trading for a living who are asking the question of, is there a way of using kind of the results of Gen AI, use it in a way where I can get access to those results quicker, so with less latency, in order to give me a trading advantage. It might be too early there's probably lots more low-hanging fruit of how to use Gen AI if you're a trader. That doesn't really matter at the fidelity of latency that we've been talking about. But over time, there's probably going to be some clever use cases that people come up with that say, where my real advantage is not that I'm learning something unique with Gen AI, it's that I'm learning it more quickly than others and getting trades off before others are able to do it. And who knows, maybe latency comes into play there.
Well, and I think in your neck of the woods, I'm curious about the same thing, but in the space of quantum computing and quantum communications.
Yes.
Right, because ultimately that allows for the parallelization and of quantum computing, and then my understanding of quantum communications is outside of the security aspect. Right, if we can create a real product that starts to use entanglement and things that will allow communication at a much larger distance with much lower latency. So it's be interesting to see where that takes us in the next decade.
Yeah,
I think you're very active in that space, right?
Yeah, I think the first application you're describing, and I think this is an area where the people in your universe, we might get some benefit from having some conversation, is in timekeeping. So distributed timekeeping. So the
precision, precision time. One of the first applications of kind of this new wave of quantum, there's a category called quantum sensing, and the quantum sensing starts with kind of timekeeping. It then gets applied to things like global positioning systems will give way to quantum positioning systems. You'll be able to use sensing to look, deep into the Earth or deep into the Moon to discover kind of rare minerals. So sensing has a lot of applications, but it starts first with timekeeping and distributed timekeeping. So right now, the precision of time in a Chicago exchange versus New York exchange is predicated on a certain fidelity of timekeeping. There's an opportunity to not just make that more precisely linked, but also build a network so that the actual timekeeping, the expensive clocks, then communicate in a quantum way to many different points. So someone's operating a network, using fiber, but really distributing this really accurate time, with the notion that there's probably a benefit to trading networks for that. I think there is a future where that will help a ton, because timing has always mattered, on quantitative trading, and even the current best timing devices out there came out of a similar background, right? They came out of CERN in Switzerland with what's been popularized as White Rabbit, and that is an order of magnitude better than other timing. And this, I don't know what quantum is, but just it should be orders of magnitude even more precise.
Yeah. So and the best clocks already are based on quantum, but it's, there's a generation, and I'm not talking about quantum technology that is yet to be invented or will be rolled out.
You're talking about mechanical clocks.
Talking about right now.
Yeah, atomic clocks. Now.
Yeah, that's happening as the first wave of quantum sensing in this new realm of quantum. So, the opportunity to think through, okay, if I'm going to build a quantum network, what would I use it for? I kind of liken this to the very early days of building out the network that became the internet. Well, you need an application. Well, the first application probably is going to be timekeeping, not security.
Yeah, okay.
And it's probably going to be either data center or financial trading related. But the actual activity of doing that, to my knowledge, has not yet begun. But the idea is there, to be worked on.
I really enjoyed your conversation with Jun Yi.
Yeah. Oh, you missed that one.
That was. I felt that was really good, and a super interesting guy talking around just these topics.
Yep. Well, let's do some signatures. We're coming to the end of our time. So this one here, let's get you on the same page as these other three, maybe on the cross of that one. This is going to be the most valuable Flash Boys book ever, given all the personalized notes. And then I'm going to give you a personalized note on this one as well. I'm putting you on the spot, so now you got to get clever while we're all watching. Did we ever hear back? Oh, we did hear back. Oh, he wasn't available. Oh, that's too bad. Well, Dan, we'll have you on here to tell us the real stories. So I'm going to tell you in this what I told everyone earlier, that you made a big difference in the career of a lot of up-and-comers. And I know they know that.
That means a lot.
About it,
that means
you should feel great about that.
That means the most. And I appreciate the opportunity that you gave me and the fun that I had working with you and your team over the years. It was a great ride and a lot of fun.
Yep. Well, thank you.
Yep.
All right. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars. If If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe on your listening platform. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Kendall Weinberg, with support from Gibson Seekert, Katie McDonald, and Elise Pettigrew.